Welcome to a new mystery, friends. Tell me, where are you listening from this time? Is it a bright morning with the kettle just boiled, or the hour when the streets outside are empty and you half expect a knock at the door? In Flaxborough, Mrs. Edith Mowbray's passing was politely called a brief but spirited illness. Her estate, every last penny, left to something called the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice. Admirable, perhaps, except the hospice closed years ago. Inspector Purbright knows this much. In Flaxborough, a bequest is never just a bequest, and some charities have very curious friends indeed. The news of Mrs. Edith Mowbray's death travelled along Flaxborough's more respectable channels within hours of the vicar's announcement. In the High Street, it passed from chemist to draper as discreetly as a banknote pressed into the wrong palm. In the tea-room of Mrs. Bellamy's establishment, it was delivered with the appropriate tone of sorrow, followed, inevitably, by a measured survey of the deceased's social and charitable credentials. The official cause, as given by Reverend Chalmers, was a brief but spirited illness, a phrasing that allowed those who wished to imagine a tidy, even gallant exit to do so, while others quietly recalled how often spiritedness in Flaxborough meant resistance to advice from one's physician. Mrs. Mowbray, at 72, had retained an appearance of disciplined well-being. That is, she looked the way someone does who believes ailments are best discouraged by ignoring them. Her solicitor, Mr. Fenning, emerged from the dark recesses of his office to make a statement to the Flaxborough Chronicle. Mrs. Mowbray's estate, he said, was to be bequeathed in its entirety to the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice. The declaration was received in public with approving nods. "So like Edith," remarked Mrs. Tanner of the Ladies' Guild, "always thinking of others, even at the last." Privately, in kitchens and back parlours, there was some murmuring among those who had thought themselves closer friends of Edith than any hospice could be. Inspector Purbright learned of the bequest in the police station's small common room, where Sergeant Malley, reading the morning paper over a sausage roll, relayed the news in the same tone he might have used for a shipping delay. "Entire estate," Malley remarked, wiping a crumb from his mustache. "Not a farthing to family, so it says here." "Does it?" said Purbright mildly, without looking up from his tea. "That will have exercised a few drawing rooms already, I imagine." Malley gave a short, appreciative grunt. "Never heard of the charity myself." "Have you?" Purbright shook his head. "Only of St. Luke, and I doubt he incorporated." On the day of the funeral, the weather behaved in the proper way. Overcast but not wet, chilly enough to justify dark coats. The service at St. Luke's was decorous and unhurried. Purbright, attending in his capacity as a polite fixture of civic life rather than as a policeman, found himself observing not the words of the eulogy, but the congregation itself. There was the Ladies' Guild in disciplined rows, each hat perfectly centred, the town's better sort of shopkeepers, 2 aldermen yawning with care, and a scattering of younger people whose connection to Mrs. Mowbray seemed to rest solely on inherited attendance. Noticeable, too, were the absences. The widow's niece, for instance, currently in Gibraltar, had sent only a wreath and a vaguely affectionate telegram. Certain neighbours who might have been expected to appear had chosen instead, or so the murmurs suggested, to remain at home with colds. The seating arrangement told its own story. Those in the front rows, well within the vicar's benevolent gaze, could be assumed to have had dealings with Mrs. Mowbray deemed socially creditable. Those at the back seemed to be there chiefly to watch the front. After the service, in the slow drift toward the churchyard gates, Purbright found himself intercepted by Mrs. Tanner. "You'll be missing her as much as we all shall, Inspector," she began, with the faintly proprietary air of one who assumes the bereavement of others must be proportionate to her own. She was a familiar figure, Purbright allowed. Indeed, and so generous. Why, only last spring she lent her drawing room for our chrysanthemums, and always such a support to the hospice. Purbright made a polite sound of agreement. "Of course," Mrs. Tanner continued, lowering her voice to the range considered discreet in Flaxborough, which is to say, audible to anyone in a 6-foot radius. "I cannot quite recall who the other friends of St. Luke's are. I'm not sure I've ever met them." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "they are a modest order." In the churchyard, mourners clustered in small knots, discussing the coffin's quality, the vicar's sermon, and the late Mrs. Mowbray's tendency to use her charitable activities as a means of arranging other people's diaries. Purbright lingered long enough to overhear 2 aldermen agreeing that these bequests are best left unquestioned for decency's sake, which, to his ear, confirmed that someone was already questioning them. By the time the hearse had departed, Purbright's sense of professional interest, while still officially idle, had been lightly stirred. The Friends of St. Luke's Hospice did not feature in any recent civic reports he could recall. The last public mention of a hospice in Flaxborough had been some years earlier, when a proposal to open one had foundered for lack of funds, or, as Purbright privately suspected, for lack of a suitable committee willing to share credit. He walked back to the station by way of the High Street, noting how shopkeepers glanced up from their tills to exchange the look reserved for communal speculation. Flaxborough, in its quiet way, was already fitting the bequest into its intricate social puzzle. Some saw in it an act of selfless virtue. Others suspected a pointed exclusion of certain relations. Still others, schooled in the town's subtler customs, wondered whether the charity might serve a purpose less edifying than its name suggested. In his office, Purbright poured himself another cup of tea and sat for a while, allowing the various threads to lie undisturbed in his mind. It was not his business, at present, to untangle them, yet he could not help noting how, in Flaxborough, money given away was seldom given without a design, and that a design, once traced, often led to doors people preferred to keep closed. Later that afternoon, a junior clerk from the Chronicle delivered a typed copy of Mr. Fenning's statement for the station's records. Purbright scanned it without much interest until his eye fell on a small typographical curiosity: the registered address of the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice was not a hospital or a parish office, but a flat above a shuttered haberdashery in Church Street. He read the line twice, then set the paper down. It might be nothing. In Flaxborough, it was almost certainly something. He placed the sheet neatly on one side, the way a man does when he has no intention of forgetting it, and returned to the afternoon's minor duties: a missing bicycle, a complaint about loud wireless sets, and a lost cat last seen in the vicinity of the co-op. Yet, between these small occupations, the address in Church Street kept presenting itself like a card slid discreetly across a table. By the time the station clock chimed 5, Purbright had reached no conclusions and sought none. But the thought of Mrs. Mowbray's immaculate hats, her spirited illness, and her friends, such as they were, had formed a small, persistent knot at the back of his mind. He suspected it would remain there, quietly tightening until something or someone offered to loosen it. Church Street, having retired from commerce some years before the rest of the town thought it necessary, now lived in a half-sheltered quiet that suited dust and elderly pigeons. Number 17, once a haberdashery of reassuring modesty, had surrendered its windows to sun-faded cards that still promised elastic by the yard and buttons assorted. A narrow door in the alley bore a brass plate that could not decide whether to be dignified or furtive: the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice. The letters were newly polished, as if conscience had buffed them that very morning. Purbright let himself in with a knock that suggests both patience and a warrant, without actually possessing either. The stair rose grudgingly. It smelt of old gum and the industrious failure of mothballs. On the landing, a door stood ajar upon a room which a previous tenant had once, perhaps hopefully, called the office. The name had outlived the furnishing. There was, at any rate, no desk. There was a table of the kind one sees in parish halls and beneath which stale buns go to end their days, a wooden chair with a morally improving straight back, a tin filing cabinet mislaid from a more purposeful decade, and a succession of cardboard archive boxes that looked as though they had been labelled by different temperaments and then stacked by none. On the mantelpiece, a clock had given up at 17 minutes past 2 and, finding this suited everyone, remained. "Ah," said a voice from the inner doorway. The police. Its owner stepped into view with the caution of one, remembering whether he had ever been pleased to see the police. He was of a stooped, administrative build, the kind of man who irons paper. "Hepplewhite," he supplied. "Caretaker." "Inspector Purbright," said Purbright, carefully not offering a card. "You maintain the premises for the Friends?" "Indeed," said Mr. Hepplewhite, with the calm of a man who will not be hurried into an admission that might prove inconvenient. "In a voluntary capacity." Purbright glanced about the room. On the table lay a small stack of parish newsletters, each folded with a prim exactitude. Beside them, a ledger with ruled lines so stern they might have been trained at a military academy. "You are fortunate," Purbright observed mildly, "in your overheads." The Friends appear to require very little in the way of furniture. Mr. Hepplewhite considered the bare table, then adopted a tone of superior explanation. "We like to keep things fluid, Inspector. Modern charities, you know. Mobility, agility." "Of course," said Purbright. "And the hospice itself?" Mr. Hepplewhite allowed himself the sigh of a man who has borne misunderstanding long enough. "Closed," he said, "long before the Friends were formed. As to why that should be so, I am not in a position to—" He made a small movement with his hand that might have been intended for both resignation and authority. "However, our paperwork is all in hand." "In hand," repeated Purbright amicably. "How reassuring." Hepplewhite, encouraged by what he mistook for agreement, moved to the table and arranged the newsletters with a finger and thumb precision suggestive of a lifelong friendship with string. "Here you see our communications arm, a rigorous record of appeals, acknowledgements, and thanks." Purbright opened the top newsletter. In a column headed Gratitudes appeared 3 names, Wednesday after Wednesday, in a sequence that would have warmed the heart of any statistician. Mrs. G. Pelham, Mr. J. Rook, Miss M. Dalrymple. The sums varied within a careful range that spoke of a delicate arithmetic. Neither generous enough to arouse envy, nor meagre enough to invite remarks. "Reliable supporters," said Hepplewhite, a little quickly. "Indeed," said Purbright. "So reliable as to be almost habitual." Hepplewhite lifted a shoulder. "One admires consistency in a fickle age, Inspector. The Friends have always believed in a steady stream rather than theatrical floods." "The Friends," Purbright repeated, as if trying the phrase for comfort. "Do they attend fetes, church bring-and-buys, the usual rounds?" A veil came down behind Mr. Hepplewhite's spectacles. "They support us in the manner they deem appropriate." "Of course, and where, if it is not an indiscretion to ask, are the Friends themselves?" Mr. Hepplewhite consulted the mantel clock, perhaps to verify that it was not 2:45 after all. "Occupied," he said. "Many demands. Good works are fatiguing, Inspector." Purbright allowed the ledger to lie open under his hand, without, strictly speaking, reading it. Its columns were fastidious, but curiously thin. Dates were frequent. Destinations were modestly characterized as general relief or ongoing commitments. He recognized the vocabulary of organizations that cannot quite say to whom money goes, because money prefers not to be followed. "And Mrs. Mowbray's bequest," he asked, still looking at the ledger, "will be similarly committed?" "Precisely." Hepplewhite brightened at the opportunity for a prepared sentence. "The late Mrs. Mowbray's generosity will enable the Friends to finalize a number of pending obligations and to enhance future outreach." "One admires ambition," said Purbright, closing the ledger with the softness one uses for sleeping babies and disintegrating accounts. Although I confess I had understood the hospice to be no longer. How did you put it? In a position? Hebblewhite smiled with his mouth and kept his eyes for later. The hospice, Inspector, is not a building. It is a spirit. Ah, said Purbright. Then your overheads must be lower than I feared. May I take one of these? He touched the top newsletter. Please do, said Hebblewhite, and added, with a carelessness that had been rehearsed, we do ask that communications with the friends be routed through me for the present. Entirely sensible, said Purbright. These things can so easily become untidy. He left a few minutes later with the newsletter folded into his pocket, the brass plate's polish still fresh in his mind. On the way down the stair he noticed, in a corner where dust had the upper hand, a carton of unused envelopes. They were addressed in advance to subscribers, the plural achieved by optimism. He paused, as men do when a slight adjustment to the angle of their head seems likely to reveal a truth, and then continued down. Flaxborough's light that morning had decided to be industrious without being cheerful, made the pavement honest. Across the road a woman shook a mat, glancing left and right as though the act required witnesses. Purbright stood for a moment at the edge of the alley, the better to be encountered by anyone who felt a desire to be helpful. That species is not rare in Flaxborough. It is merely cautious. "Inspector," said a voice at his shoulder, having practiced the approach. Purbright turned to meet a man whose coat had once been brown and had suffered improvements. He introduced himself as Mr. Trellis of the premises next door, where he respected the rods and lines of fishing enthusiasts. "We have admired your brass," Trellis went on, with a nod towards the plate. "Very correct. I suppose one must show respect when dealing in charity." "One must," said Purbright, watching the man's eyes discover various elements of the alley in deliberate sequence. "You wouldn't think," Trellis added, "that a hospice would require so little in the way of chairs. Still, if the poor are to be comforted spiritually, they will not sit long." "Evidently not," said Purbright. Mr. Trellis adjusted his tone to confidences. "Of course, Mrs. Mowbray did her bit, often in the evenings. Not here," he added quickly. "At hers. She was visited. Regular as the gas man, but after dark." "A doctor?" asked Purbright, too lightly to be believed. "Not to my knowledge. No bag, for one thing. And not kin either. We know the family when we see them. They bring suitcases and a view about the curtains. This gentleman brought neither, except," Mr. Trellis reflected, "he did carry something once or twice. Narrow box, longish. The sort florists send when they don't trust the recipient to cut stems properly." "How thoughtful," said Purbright. "Thoughtful is the word," Mr. Trellis agreed. "Always after dark. Remained an hour, sometimes more. Quiet sort of knock when he came, but a brisk step when he left, as if, well," he examined the pavement, "as if business had been concluded." "Flaxborough is noted for efficiency," Purbright observed. Mr. Trellis smiled with community pride. "We manage." The conversation expiring at a civilized pace, Purbright thanked him and turned towards the high street. The newsletter sat squarely in his pocket, like a curate determined to be of use. Names, too, arranged themselves with the helpful orderliness of minutes: Pelham, Rook, Dalrymple. Respectable syllables, all three, and curiously unencumbered by the usual traces of civic enthusiasm. No raffle prizes, no appearances at jam tables, no photographs of damp smiles in the Chronicle. He called in at Mrs. Teatime's as the morning slipped into that respectable limbo between errands and lunch. Miss Teatime, whose talent for hospitality lay chiefly in implying that any arrival was both expected and faintly behindhand, had already steered a Battenberg to the front of the queue. "You have been to inspect charity?" she asked, cutting symmetrical slices with the air of a woman delivering verdicts. "How brave." "Courage is cheap when there are no chairs," said Purbright, accepting a plate. Miss Teatime's eyebrows performed a small courtesy. No chairs. That speaks of purpose. When one cannot sit, one must depart. And when one departs, one cannot ask questions. An admirable reduction of noise, said Purbright. He placed the newsletter on the tablecloth. You take an interest in the parish lists. These names, do they ring your bell? She adjusted her spectacles and read with the brisk concern of a treasurer reviewing an alibi. Mrs. G. Pelham, she said. Not ours. The Horticultural Society boasts a Pelham, but she is Greta and prefers bulbs to people. Mr. Rook? No, not a guild man. He avoids raffles with the integrity of a teetotaler avoiding gin. Miss Dalrymple. Faintly musical, I seem to recall, in the sense that she once donated sheet music to the church that the organist could not in conscience perform. So none of them, Purbright said, are frequently seen where plates circulate. Not among the respectable plates, Miss Teatime allowed. But then, Inspector, there are other plates. He sipped his tea. Our caretaker assures me the hospice is a spirit. A spirit, Miss Teatime repeated, tasting the word as if it might be overproof. How comforting for the dying. Quite. He also assures me that their paperwork is all in hand. She smiled. Whose hand? A question I neglected to press, said Purbright. There were no hands available for demonstration. Miss Teatime took up the newsletter again and tapped the edge of the column. Look at the amounts. They fluctuate obediently. Nothing untidy, no windfalls, no lapses. It is the rhythm of a metronome, not of enthusiasm. When people give from the heart, they do it badly. And when they do it well, said Purbright, one suspects rehearsal. Or direction, she suggested, a conductor somewhere, hidden behind the palms. He left her with half the Battenberg and the whole of her satisfaction, stepping back into a street that had arranged itself precisely where he had left it. The town's silence was the civic kind, not the rural, more like a library that intends to be overheard. He walked past the Chronicle office and nodded to the junior clerk, who nodded back with the strenuous gravity the young reserved for the police. The afternoon arranged small tasks for him, a telephone inquiry that tried to sound irrelevant, a note from the station that meant to be routine. In between, a pattern, admittedly faint, proposed itself with such good manners that it would have been churlish to ignore it. A charity with no chairs, donors who did not appear in photographs, a caretaker who preferred spirits to buildings, a widow who received after dark, a gentleman with the taste to bring flowers in boxes that precluded conversation. At 4 o'clock, Purbright returned to Church Street and stood opposite number 17. The brass plate held its shine as honestly as before. From somewhere indoors came the soft, officious click of paper being put into a file, followed, after a discreet interval, by the even softer click of paper being taken out again. On the landing, behind the curtained window, a shape passed and paused in the manner of a person deciding whether a visitor has gone. Purbright did not cross the road. He did not knock. He simply adjusted the newsletter in his pocket so that the names lay uppermost and walked away at a pace that suggested indifference. It is sometimes useful in Flaxborough to appear to have put something down. That evening, when the station was otherwise preoccupied with the affairs of an unaccompanied dog, Purbright copied into his notebook 3 lines. Only, Pelham, Rook, Dalrymple. Underneath, in a hand that he permitted to be marginally more pointed than usual, he wrote, "Why always the same?" He closed the book and sat for a moment in the expectant quiet a town grants its policemen when it hopes to be agreed with. From the window, the street was prudent and exact. Somewhere in it walked a man who carried flowers after dark, and somewhere above a shuttered shop a charity held meetings without chairs. Neither fact was unlawful. Both were untidy. And while Purbright had, so far, been given nothing resembling a crime, he had been given that which Flaxborough reliably supplied in its place, a cluster of good intentions that did not quite bear inspection. He turned out his lamp. The room surrendered its detail at once, except for the pale rectangle of the newsletter on the desk. It kept the names visible a moment longer, as if they had ideas of their own about being forgotten. Then the paper, like the town, returned to its customary discretion and left behind, for the first time, a question with edges on it. By the time the town had finished praising the late Mrs. Mowbray for her tact, her chrysanthemums, and her capacity to call a spade a garden implement, Inspector Purbright was in possession of something less celebratory, a slim packet of her correspondence, bound with the sort of ribbon that implies virtue while providing only moderate restraint. It had come to him by way of Mr. Fenning's junior clerk, a pale youth who possessed the agreeable ability to look both purposeful and forgettable when entering public offices with envelopes. The letters were not numerous. Mrs. Mowbray had been a woman of telephone calls and doorstep conversations. Paper, to her, belonged to invitations and condolences. Yet here were 9 sheets, all from the last year, each a small petition for money advanced until matters settle. None were signed with full names. Instead, initials arranged themselves at the bottoms of pages like shy signatures. G.P. Jr. M.D. Purbright laid them side by side along his desk and admired their restraint. Even their amounts seemed chosen to soothe, sums unlikely to injure a widow while proving that the borrowers enjoyed an understanding of arithmetic and scruple. The stationery, thick enough to insist upon itself, bore at the corner a faint impression of a crest that did not care to be identified. Under certain angles of light, it confessed to being the letterhead of the Regent Hotel in Barrowby, a town distinguished chiefly by its belief that respectability is a function of curtains. The Regent's notepaper, in keeping with its house style, had been persuaded to behave like plain stock by the expedient of indifference. The watermark, however, had retained a more stubborn memory. Purbright turned each sheet and examined it for the fussy characteristics that crimes and charities share. Blots, careful crossings out, a diligence that tips into choreography. The hand varied, sometimes a neat commercial loop, sometimes a schoolmistress's upright clarity. Yet a likeness persisted, as if in writing to Mrs. Mowbray, all supplicants had unconsciously adopted the tone and even the gait of a person entering a good drawing-room by the side door. No address appeared, only requests for small loans to be left with the usual intermediary, or our agreed channel. He had Sergeant Malley copy the texts with a clerkly exactness. Malley, who liked the sort of cases one could fold, looked at the initials and said, "Could be anyone," as though thereby absolving the town from future inconvenience. Purbright encouraged him with silence. His inquiries at the Regent were made quietly and without the fanfare that causes hotel managers to attend to their duties. He travelled to Barrowby as a man seeking the kind of lunch that disappoints without offending. The Regent, receiving him, produced the confident hush of a place convinced that scandal has always chosen other premises. The foyer had carpets which, by their pattern, discouraged footprints from arranging themselves into narratives. The manager emerged from behind a desk of polished serenity with the expression preferred by those who use the word clientele in sentences about privacy. He was gracious and deferential, and so determined to be unhelpful that one felt almost obliged to tip him for it. "Of course, Inspector," he murmured, having been told only that Purbright wished to confirm whether certain paper had been employed in the hotel's correspondence. "We do occasionally provide stationery to our guests as a courtesy. I hardly like to inquire into their literary habits." "A wise economy," said Purbright. He laid one letter gently on the desk, as a doctor might present an X-ray that only one party would find illuminating. "This crest, light like an afterthought. Yours, I think?" The manager examined it with an interest made deliberately insufficient to arrive anywhere. "Could be anyone's," he observed, having adopted Sergeant Malley's theological view. "Could," agreed Purbright. Yet hotels with elastic notions of private dining are not abundant in Barrett, and the region's elasticity has, I believe, a certain local fame. The manager smiled as if accepting a compliment offered by a foreigner whose customs were quaint. "We do accommodate special gatherings," he said primly. "Intimate, dignified, entirely above board. Birthdays, retirements, that sort of thing." "Charities," suggested Purbright, as if trying a new dish. "Occasionally, though we find that truly charitable works prefer sunshine to curtains." "Ah," said Purbright, "then we are in agreement." He was shown, with a patience that would have suited a museum, a succession of writing desks from which one might, if so minded, compose letters of aching propriety. Nothing in their drawers suggested Mrs. Mowbray's visitors had done anything more than dab a nib. In the bar, a waiter recalled a party of 4 or 5 who favoured Tuesday nights and who requested, with elaborate modesty, the small room at the back where, through no fault of its own, sound behaved in a conspiring manner. "Pleasant enough, sir," the waiter said, "but keen on accounts being settled with exactitude." "Exactitude is a virtue," said Purbright, "when carefully directed." Back in Flaxborough, the parish council, which derived its sense of significance from the number of papers before it, received a circular with a conviction of importance unusual even in that confident body. The envelope, addressed to the council as a whole, bore a typewritten label, always a worrying sign in a town that prefers handwriting to accountability. Inside, a neatly folded notice announced a final disbursement dinner of the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice, to be held at the Old Swan on Friday next, 7 for 7:30. Attendees were invited to share in the closing of a chapter and to celebrate charitable continuities. "Final," the chairwoman observed, pronouncing the word with that mixture of relief and apprehension committees reserve for endings. "How very decisive." "Disbursement," added the treasurer, tasting it. "I suppose that means money will be leaving." "Dinner," said a third member, whose wife managed him through cookery. "That at least is clear." The vicar, caught between pastoral good nature and fiscal unease, looked to the end of the circular for a signature. It offered none, only the functional assurance that friends would be in attendance to receive expressions of support. The Old Swan was noted, even loved, for its custard. It was less famous for clarity. The council elected, by a majority that left everybody free to be virtuous, to accept the invitation as a body. Polite gratitude would be extended in the meantime. A copy of the circular came to Purbright by a route known as Miss Teatime. She had a way of being present when paper was being admired, which might, in a larger town, have attracted professional jealousy. She arrived at the station with the look of a woman who wishes to borrow a pen, while reminding the constabulary that civilization is a fragile achievement. "What do you make of it?" she asked, placing the circular on his desk with the care given to bread placed before ducks. "Final disbursement. I cannot recall a first." "Perhaps the friends proposed to disburse chronology itself," said Purbright. He weighed the sheet between finger and thumb. The typewriter's ribbon had been changed recently. The letters stood up straight, as if on parade. At the bottom, a line announced that inquiries might be addressed to Mr. Hepplewhite, caretaker at the Church Street Rooms. "Your spiritual hospice," Miss Teatime remarked dryly. "Evidently in good health," said Purbright. "One hears of buildings that exist, chiefly in minutes. Spirits, I suppose, prefer dinners." Miss Teatime sat, having allowed herself to be offered a chair with the air of one blessing a ritual. "And have you found any of your friends in the telephone book?" "In spirit," said Purbright. "On paper, alas, they decline to be listed. However, Mrs. Mowbray's correspondence proves that their interests extended to small, regular finances, until matters settle." "Matters," said Miss Teatime, "rarely settle when money is involved. They develop." He showed her the copied letters. She read them with the speed and comprehension of a woman who has audited both parish and suitor. "Initials," she said, "are unpromising. Only children, criminals, and committees sign with them. The crest, though, is locally notorious. The regent's manager supplies privacy in the same manner as a hat supplies weatherproofing, sufficient until it rains." "I encountered that meteorology," said Purbright. "He is at pains to recall nothing, though the staff remember a discreet party on Tuesdays. Private dining was interpreted to include private accounting." Miss Teatime considered. "Do you suppose our friends sought more than soup? That they used the regent's stationery out of an aesthetic impulse, or because anonymity is cheaper than boxes at the post office?" "One would not wish to deny them taste," said Purbright. They agreed, by gentle implication, that the Old Swan's dinner warranted attendance. "No speeches," Purbright said. "On the contrary," Miss Teatime returned. "The sort of people who refuse lists cannot resist speeches." That afternoon, Purbright called at Church Street once more, for the simple pleasure of watching the brass plate maintain its glitter. Mr. Hepplewhite was in residence and had contrived, within the limits of the room, a semblance of bustle. Stacked newsletters, an open ledger, and a vase containing 3 carnations who had seen worse days. He greeted Purbright with the benevolence of a man who has successfully hosted paperwork. "You have had my circular," Hepplewhite said, before the inspector had the opportunity to deny it. "We feel it important to mark transitions." "Quite," said Purbright, "and final has such a satisfying sound." "Closure," Hepplewhite mused, as if testing a fashionable word on the palate. "It lends reassurance." "I imagine so." Purbright allowed himself to look at the ledger without the vulgarity of touching it. The pages were newly numbered, a device that often arrives late in the life of such books. "I note the dinner is to be held at the Old Swan, an institution of established viscosity." "The custard is admired," Hepplewhite agreed. "We are fortunate in our connections there." "Connections," said Purbright. "How agreeable." Mr. Hepplewhite's expression underwent a subtle rearrangement, not unlike a man shifting in a chair that promises comfort without intending it. "We shall be joined by our regular supporters," he continued carefully. "Those who have kept faith. Mrs. Pelham, Mr. Rook, Miss Dalrymple?" Purbright offered, pleasantly. If the names produced recognition, they were not allowed to complete their journey to the face. "We are always grateful," Hepplewhite replied, "for consistent generosity." "Consistency," said Purbright, "is underrated in some quarters. May I inquire, purely from an administrative interest, whether the invitations were addressed individually or by committee?" "Both," said Hepplewhite, with a sigh that accepted the burdens of multiple adjectives. "An economy in stamps becomes a moral imperative when one is charitable." Purbright looked once more at the carnations. They were white. He noticed, without their help, a slim cardboard sheath in the wastebasket. A florist's box lid, its label torn but still legible. "Dalrymple and Son, nurserymen, deliveries Tuesday and Friday." He did not move. He merely allowed his gaze to return to Mr. Hepplewhite's tidy face. "Your office," he said, "seems to agree with Tuesday." Hepplewhite blinked the way a man does when a draft crosses a room he had thought sealed. "Does it?" "Perhaps I imagine patterns," Purbright said, and smiled sufficiently to suggest he did not. He left with a copy of the circular and the sense, familiar in Flaxborough, that decency had once again been arranged over a shape best not described. On his way back to the station, he paused in front of the Chronicle window, where a notice for the Old Swan's set menus leaned against a faded photograph of the Horticultural Society's prize begonias. Someone, possibly the junior clerk with an instinct for accuracy, had moved the dinner announcement half an inch so that it no longer obscured the begonias label. The adjustment was trivial, but it possessed the neatness of an editorial correction, a small, firm insistence that things be properly named. That evening, while Malley wrestled with a report on missing hens, which had, according to their owner, inadvertently joined a friend. Purbright sorted the letters into a second order, not by date, but by hand. He saw, within the imitation of discretion, a recurring flourish in the capital D, a reluctance to complete the loop in P, and a J that began high, like a person stepping down from a bus he had not meant to board. He wrote in his notebook, beneath the initials, a small and very domestic question: who buys the paper and cuts the carnations? He closed the book and turned down the lamp. From the street came the unremarkable sound of the town placing itself into evening, blinds adjusted, steps swept, the day's opinions carefully returned to their drawers. On his desk, the circular for a final disbursement lay beneath the regent's letterhead, the two papers touching like neighbours forced to agree. Between them, neither heavy nor light, the inspector felt the weight of something that had not yet settled, and that, being Flaxborough, might never do so without a dinner. The Old Swan had chosen, some time after the armistice, to end its relations with modernity. Its wallpaper, last renewed in 1912, displayed a pattern of competent vines that had lost none of their stamina, and the corridor to the private room maintained an odour reminiscent of careful gravy and furniture polish applied with filial piety. A small card on the door announced Friends of St. Luke's Hospice, final disbursement dinner, the hyphen exuding a self-possession unusual in punctuation. Inside, the table had been laid to suggest abundance while carefully avoiding it. The cutlery enjoyed a stately separation from the plates. A procession of cruets implied a plenitude of choices that salt and pepper alone could never supply. The centerpiece was a low arrangement of white carnations whose petals appeared determined to behave, even when no one else would. Mr. Hepplewhite stood at the head with the satisfaction of a man who has coaxed a room into existing. He wore a tie that could have taught the timid how to knot themselves, and the solemn expression of a minor official about to release balloons. To his right sat Mrs. Greta Pelham, who had a way of watering conversations at their roots. Beside her, Mr. J. Rook, thin in a manner that suggested abstinence rather than deprivation, and Miss M. Dalrymple, whose smile conveyed gratitude for music she could not quite hear. On the left, a retired bank clerk of fragile pride introduced himself as Mr. Lomer. Beyond him, the vicar's sister, Miss Chalmers, wearing an air of moral weather. Next to her, Mrs. Gedge, a draper's widow who believed that fabrics, like opinions, ought to be pressed. At the far end, as if the room had been unwilling to place him anywhere more conspicuous, sat a man whom Inspector Purbright recognized with the mild surprise one reserves for recurring ailments. Mr. Basil Snetterton, once admonished in open court for a fraud so modest it had seemed almost domestic. Purbright's own place was halfway down, where one may observe without becoming responsible. He noted, with that polite curiosity Flaxborough grants to menus, that the custard would be lumpy. The Old Swan's reputation for this delicacy had outlasted several council chairmen. Mr. Hepplewhite opened proceedings with the gentle rattle of a spoon against glass. "Friends," he began, allowing the word to swell until it found its edges, "we gather in the spirit of charity, which, as we all know, endureth." He paused, either for memory or approval. "Endureth beyond buildings or offices. In these difficult times, constancy is our greatest asset." It was a speech perfected by repetition, composed chiefly of large nouns connected by modest verbs, and entirely free of nouns too small to thrive unattended: widow, beneficiary, need. The company listened with the docility of people who understand that speeches are a tax paid by the respectable to maintain their status. Mr. Lomer, the bank clerk, offered a supplementary observation about prudence. Miss Chalmers contributed the thought that charity ought to be as noiseless as damp weather. Mrs. Gedge affirmed that the late Mrs. Mowbray had been a tower, as if towers were apparatus loaned by the Almighty to widows of good taste. Mr. Rook and Miss Dalrymple applauded their own restraint by saying very little. Mrs. Pelham observed that kindness, like perennials, flourished when divided properly. Mr. Snetterton confined himself to nodding with the well-bred assent of a man conscious that attention does him no good. Throughout, the name of any actual recipient was careful to remain in its drawer. When Mrs. Mowbray's name arose, it did so in the manner of a bird one does not wish to startle. At its mention, eyes slid to the carnations, sentences adjusted to flower show results or the vicar's winter appeal for warm socks. Purbright had the satisfied sense of a hypothesis returning to sit where he had left it. Soup arrived in bowls that believed in their own depth. It was of a variety that tasted of its intention. While the company applied itself, Mr. Hepplewhite distributed with a furtive grandeur folded cards printed with expressions of support, welcomed and beneath in smaller type, for the attention of the caretaker. The font possessed a certain metal fatigue. The lower-case e showed a weakness at its top that caused it to lean, faintly, leftwards. Purbright remembered the circular's type displaying the same diminished spine. He placed his card under his knife with the expression of a man reserving judgment for dessert. Conversation, in its modest way, circulated. Mrs. Pelham, who could be relied upon to water even arid topics, described the discouraging habits of asters. Miss Chalmers contributed the parish calendar in the tone of an inventory. Mr. Lomer recounted, with a shy relish, past Christmases at the bank when coin had been scarce, banknotes dear, and ledgers written beautifully despite both. Mrs. Gedge delivered, as if she were pinning it to a display, a defense of clothing as a moral influence. Mr. Rook preferred to smile upon every remark as a man smiles upon weather. Miss Dalrymple made soft parentheses of agreement. Purbright's engagement in this movement was unhurried. He supplied, when appropriate, a small remark that could neither injure nor attach him. Several times, Mrs. Mowbray's name trembled on a lip and was replaced by arrangements, legacy, intentions. He noticed that when someone risked the syllables, Mrs. Mumba, Mr. Snetterton's hand found his water-glass as if by reflex, and Mr. Hepplewhite developed an interest in his serviette. The fish course achieved the commendable state of being exactly adequate. Between fish and fowl, Mr. Hepplewhite rose again to speak of transitions. He made reference to final disbursements with the kind of satisfaction found in railway staff announcing the last train. He used the word closure, which set upon the table like a dome. To that end, he concluded, we invite those who have kept faith to affirm their support as we conclude our affairs. Your constancy has been the pillar upon which this noble effort has found its fulcrum. The fulcrum, receiving so public an embrace, had the grace not to shift. Coffee was announced with those small noises by which restaurants attempt to confer privacy upon the inevitable. Cups rattled discreetly. Sugar adopted a social manner. It was then that Mr. Snetterton, whose contributions had hitherto remained within the size of a nod, lifted his hand with a delicacy bordering upon art, and asked Mr. Hepplewhite, in a voice that wanted to be overheard and forgiven, whether there might be a telegram to collect. It was mentioned to me, he added, consulting nobody in particular, that a message might be expected, business of a time-sensitive nature. He smiled at the room. One hates to be a slave to modernity. Mr. Hepplewhite, similarly enslaved, expressed himself certain that the front desk would have said so. They always tell us, he murmured, nevertheless glancing towards the door. Still, no harm. Mr. Snetterton rose with reluctance that failed to disguise relief and removed himself along the corridor where the wallpaper vines prospered. The door swung after him, unoffended. Purbright tasted his coffee and discovered, as predicted, the faint moral resilience of stew. Around him, good behavior continued. Miss Chalmers expressed cautious admiration for missionary work in climates with insects. Mr. Lomer rehearsed the peculiar satisfactions of entering figures that added up on the first attempt. Mrs. Gedge deplored an outbreak of satin among bridesmaids. Mr. Rook discovered he had always approved of trifle. Miss Dalrymple reconciled herself to it. When plates were cleared, Mr. Snetterton returned. He had achieved, in absence, the improvement of a man who has communicated successfully with a force greater than himself. He resumed his seat with a correctness somewhat finer than before. Purbright, who admired small economies of expression, noticed a pale green scuff above Mr. Snetterton's right cuff, as of wax that prefers not to be called candle, and a faint, defensive sweetness lingering at his lapel. Carnations choosing, as always, to be innocent. The custard arrived in bowls that had seen things. It behaved as anticipated, holding itself together with stubborn clots that resisted the spoon. One might have admired it under other circumstances. It knew what it was and intended to remain so. It was then that Mr. Hepplewhite, who had contrived to be standing when the custard came in, proposed a moment of gratitude. "To those," he said, "who have given regularly, steadfastly, without advertisement," and his hand described, almost against his will, a small arc that included Mrs. Pelham, Mr. Rook, and Miss Dalrymple. The three accepted their inclusion with expressions calculated not to preen. Mrs. Pelham stared rather firmly at the carnations. Mr. Rook unfolded and refolded his napkin. Miss Dalrymple arranged her mouth into something that could have been called humility if one were minded to be kind. The landlord entered, working his face into neutrality. He set an envelope beside Mr. Hepplewhite's plate with the elaborate care of a man required to perform a service without possessing an opinion. "As requested, sir," he said, and retired to the safer pastures of food. Hepplewhite placed his hand over the envelope as if to prevent a draught from carrying it away. "The account," he said to no one in particular, "is in order." "Accounts," said Mr. Lomer with an attempt at gaiety, "are happiest when they are." Mrs. Pelham, in an act of horticultural tact, discussed delphiniums. The envelope remained under Hepplewhite's hand, with the quiet weight of something that has already happened. When it became permissible to rise, the company did so with a politeness disproportionate to its relief. Handshakes detoured round sincerity. There were murmurs about the admirable service, the custard's fidelity to type, the comfort of marking and ending. The carnations, having done their work, continued to be white. Mr. Snetterton encountered Purbright in the gentle crush of the cloakroom. He offered the inspector a smile of undemanding warmth. "Old institutions, Inspector," he said, rolling his gloves with care. "They are the armor of civilization." "Quite so," said Purbright. "One simply trusts that the armor does not conceal anything either." Mr. Snetterton's smile held. "You are incorrigible." "Only through habit," said Purbright. In the entrance, Miss Chalmers paused to thank Mr. Hepplewhite for a moving occasion. He bowed and supplied, in return, a phrase about chapters closing. As she turned away, he slipped the envelope, not to his pocket, which would have been vulgar, but to the inner sleeve of his minute book, where pages improve their character by proximity. Out in the corridor, the wallpaper reclaimed its dominion. Purbright walked its length slowly, more from respect than doubt. Near the swing door to the service passage, a narrow cardboard lid leaned against the skirting, almost prim. It bore, in the thin, damp print favoured by traders who distrust modern inks, Dalrymple and Son, nurserymen, deliveries, Tuesday and Friday. A trace of green wax marked one corner where string had made its contribution. The carnations in the dining room answered, without gusto, for Friday. He did not pick the lid up. He permitted himself only the brief tilt of the head which, in Flaxborough, serves as an admission that one has seen enough to remain interested. Down in the bar, a clock relieved itself of a quarter hour. The company resorted to the street, drifted towards taxis and opinions. Purbright, taking his hat from the stand, felt the faint pressure of the folded card beneath his cuff, expressions of support welcomed, and remembered the leaning E which the circular had exhibited so faithfully. He stepped out into a chill that had no more elaboration than the dinner had had beneficiaries. Church Street lay 2 turns away, and somewhere above its shuttered shop, a room waited that had no desk. He walked towards it with the lack of haste appropriate to a man who is not yet certain of a crime. As he passed the Old Swan's window, the reflection showed him steady, indistinct, and accompanied, in the glass only, by a ghostly ridge of white blooms. Back at the station, he set down 3 lines. Envelope delivered during custard. Snetterton absent at coffee. Returns improved. Dalrymple lid Friday in passage. Underneath, he wrote a question that did not quite ask to be answered. Who pays whom to bring flowers to a dinner that ends a charity? He closed the book. The page, obediently, kept the question open. Reverend Chalmers received Inspector Purbright in the vicarage drawing-room, a square chamber whose furniture seemed to have taken holy orders. The curtains, in a celibate floral, filtered the afternoon into a useful gloom. The grate, having declined to flame, offered a patient warmth. On the mantel stood a photograph of the late bishop, who appeared to be considering forgiveness as a policy. A tray had been prepared with tea that insisted on being poured before conversation could safely begin. "You have my sympathies, Inspector," said the vicar, after providing milk with the careful impartiality of a man dispensing doctrine. "Bereavements unsettle, particularly where there has been, as one might say, public engagement." "Quite," said Purbright. He rested his hat where it would feel supervised and took the cup. "I hoped you could advise me about the hospice, the Friends of St. Luke's in their charitable capacity." Reverend Chalmers folded his hands and let silence insinuate itself between them. "I should not wish," he began, "to misrepresent my acquaintance with their operations. My involvement has been, well, indirect." He looked at the bishop, who offered no refuge. "I cannot, in honesty, say that I have officiated at any hospice events. There has, to my recollection, been no formal service, no dedication, no, what is the word, launch." "Unlaunched charity," said Purbright mildly. "It must be light on ballast." "Quite." The vicar brightened fractionally, as if the nautical metaphor had put him in sight of land. "They, did speak at one time of teas, small teas, for the uplifted and the uplifting. I remain uncertain whether cups were poured in fact, or only in spirit." "Spirits have been much mentioned," Purbright observed. "The caretaker takes a high view." "Mr. Hepplewhite?" said Reverend Chalmers, and made the name sound like a footnote. "He has shown a certain energy. Paper, you know, circulars, minutes. Very proper. And yet—" He looked as though he might be about to describe the experience of entering a room that contains only its own echo. "Yet what?" prompted Purbright, with a sympathy so undemanding it could be mistaken for absent-mindedness. "Yet the sick, Inspector," the vicar said, in a voice that wished not to be heard outside. "One expects sick people in a hospice, or at least their shadows. I have encountered neither. Tea without visitors is—" He paused, searching the border between charity and satire, and safely found. "Administrative." Purbright permitted this to settle. "And Mrs. Mowbray, did she speak of the Friends?" "A little," Reverend Chalmers admitted, "in the manner of one paying subscriptions to the maintenance of respectability. She was conscientious, cheerful in the way that consists in not troubling others. During her last weeks, tired, but cheerfully so." He altered the tilt of a teaspoon as if to restrain the memory. "She declined my urging to consult further physicians. She had a preference for tinctures and for going to bed early." There was a small study beyond the drawing-room where the vicar conducted his intimacies with paper. He led the way there now, with the walk of a man bringing out a child who has been good but not gifted. "You asked about minutes," he said. "I have, as it happens, the book they left with the parish for reference. Temporarily, of course." The study presented itself as a theory of order under constant revision. Files had been stacked with contrition. On the desk lay a half-compiled service rota, several sheets of music in flats that did not flatter the organ, and a black-bound minute book dignified beyond its contents. The vicar touched the cover as one might greet a parishioner of tender conscience. "Half-filled," he said, with a sigh that credited both halves. They were keen at the beginning. Purbright set his cup aside and opened the book. Its front matter, purpose, aims, list of officers, was executed in penmanship whose portions of pride and patience were equally apportioned. Names followed as measured as a hymn. Chairman, acting, treasurer, acting, secretary, acting in the absence of both. A succession of meetings then organized themselves across the pages with a fidelity that verged on description, the same 5 attendees recurring, present or apologetic, like a litany. Hepplewhite, Pelham, Rook, Dalrymple, and one guest, whose existence persisted anonymously. "Immaculate hands," said Purbright. "They make a brave show of it." "Do they?" murmured the vicar, pleased to be told something charitable about charity. He examined the entries as a gardener inspects a border that insists on repeating one shrub. The business was entirely domestic: to review finances, to reschedule, social hour, to revisit arrangements, and the resolutions, when reached, expressed themselves in verbs that withdrew at once from action. Note, consider, commend, defer. Once, under any other business, a line referred to letters of thanks, unsent. As he turned another page, Purbright noticed the intrusion of a second hand. It kept to the margins, as if reluctant to distress the primary script. This newcomer had a cunning economy. Strokes lean, loops unobliging, a municipal hand taught to mean more than it admitted. Agreed privately. "See me." J.R. read one, stitched against an entry about pending obligations. Tuesday, 7 to 8, room behind bar, hovered beside a line concerning hospitality partners. A third note, in the same ungenerous cursive, simply added, "Old account only." "Who is J.R.?" he asked, though the answer was in his pocket already, folded into the parish newsletters and their small, tireless sums. The vicar lifted his eyebrows and allowed memory to move furniture. "Rook," he said at last. "Mr. Rook, thin man, polite, the sort whose jacket insists upon him rather than the other way round. I cannot say I know where he worships." "He may prefer wherever accounts are kept," said Purbright. He turned a page back and found the earlier entries free of marginalia. The private voice had arrived later, when confidence had learned to whisper. "It all became rather inward, I felt," said Reverend Chalmers, peering with concern that could not quite find its object. "I like to see minutes advance in public. One feels less lonely." "And you never officiated?" "No." He spoke it with relieved regret. Had there been a ward or even a tray charmingly wheeled into a hall, I should have been delighted to bless it. But meetings have never asked for prayer, Inspector. They only ask for apologies. And Mrs. Mowbray, tired but cheerfully so. Did she receive visitors besides yourself? A neighbour or two, the vicar said carefully. A gentleman as well, not family. I met him on the garden path. A civil beau, a whiff of something floral. I could not say he was a doctor. He had no bag. He shifted the minute book a quarter-inch and, as if to cleanse the conversation, added, "A cheerful woman, Mrs. Mowbray, even in her frailty. The kind who thinks gratitude is best expressed by staying out of the way." "And advanced discipline," said Purbright. "She did ask, once, whether the parish would object to the disposition of her estate. I answered, somewhat vaguely I confess, that generosity rarely provokes sermons. She seemed satisfied. We moved on to discuss harvest hymns." "Hymns are safer than airs," said Purbright. "Infinitely." The vicar, grateful to arrive at a surer theology, reached for the small pile of hymnals on a side table. "On which subject, if your pastoral patience allows, our organist has entreated that we choose less ambitious tunes for the later verses of 'All my hope on God is founded.' The sopranos are an aging regiment, Inspector. Their valor exceeds their range." Purbright made the noise sincere men produce when asked to approve matters beyond their competence. He closed the minute book and returned it to the desk, where it resumed its role as a solemn witness to rescheduling. "If I might borrow this for a day or two—" The vicar's reluctance, which had been politely present all afternoon, now stepped forward like a curate obliged to speak. "Perhaps," he suggested, "I could make you a copy of the pages in question. It is not that I doubt the worthiness of police hands, only that committees respond best to continuity, even when their work has retired from the field." "By all means," said Purbright, who had no desire to parade the friends through the Chronicle. "A copy would more than do." Reverend Chalmers relaxed, fractionally, and reached for blotting paper as if to make a start. "You will appreciate," he said, "that people here, well, they guard their reputations as one guards a gate one cannot quite see over. They are not, in my experience, wicked, only particular about shadows." "Shadows are useful," said Purbright. "They keep furniture from looking bare." They returned, with the politeness of men giving up on darker subjects, to the furnishings of parish life. The vicar described the upcoming Mothers' Union cocoa evening and the melancholy courage of a bell-ringer's knee. He rehearsed the theological problem of raffle prizes at fête, where abstinence had been promised and then discreetly postponed. The conversation acquired that restful blandness which indicates that the hour, like an orderly guest, has begun to take its leave. Purbright thanked him and rose. The vicar accompanied him down the passage with the unhurried ceremony, appropriate to a man whose profession takes a long view of departures. In the hall, a row of hats demonstrated what a century can do to brim fashion. A narrow umbrella stand, full of canes that lacked their walkers, stood like a polite congregation. As the vicar opened the door onto an afternoon hesitating towards drizzle, he remembered, with clerical solicitude, that he had not asked after Sergeant Malley's mother's chilblains. Purbright, who had no intelligence on the matter, promised to carry blessings in both directions. It would have been a normal visit, wholly successful in not quite learning anything, had not the inspector paused, as habitual as a book returning to its shelf, by a side table stacked with hymnals. Their edges had the softened look of good intentions. A slip of paper, no more than an inch deep, clung beneath the topmost copy where a corner of the binding had frayed enough to admit a small confidant. Pencil marks, in the weak boldness of people who dislike their own handwriting, delivered a message that ought to have been brisker than it was. "Funds to be collected before Tuesday. Use the old account." Purbright did not touch it. He allowed his eye to rest as if considering a spine. Then he let the hymnals be again the history of "Guide me, O thou great Redeemer," and stepped out onto the path. Reverend Chalmers, busy with the latch in a manner designed to prevent questions, spoke at once of hymn choices. "We may return to Saint Anne," he said, as though it were a village that had proved surprisingly welcoming. "Reliable, unshowy." "A sound policy," said Purbright. The drizzle had made up its mind. The vicar, seeing the inspector's hat receive it stoically, added a benediction of the practical sort. "If you are passing the Old Swan, Inspector, remind them, gently, that harvest suppers rarely benefit from novelties. Traditions are less unruly." "I shall pass it on," said Purbright. At the gate, he turned back for the brief surveyation that politeness and habit alike require. The vicar hovered behind the pane like a man caught between privacy and the parish gaze. In the study, through the thin line of sight that a careful curtain permits, The minute book waited, its second hand whispering in the margins. Tuesday, it had written of itself. Room behind bar. Old account. On the hall table, the hymnals resumed their doctrine of sturdy binding. Purbright walked towards the high street at the speed of someone content to arrive slightly late for nothing. The town, respectful of drizzle, put its head down. He was thinking, not of guilt, but of grammar. How the Friends preferred imperative pencil to declarative ink. How cheerful tiredness in a widow can resemble permission. How committees, rather than doing good, sometimes request the world to notice how comfortably they intend it. In his pocket lay Mr. Hepplewhite's circular for a final disbursement. In his head, the agreed times of Tuesday acquired the shape of a habit. He reached the station in the untheatrical manner of men returning to their desks. Before taking off his coat, he wrote in his notebook a small, undramatic sentence. Vicar's book shows J.R. in margins. Old account. Tuesday again. Find whose hymn is being sung. He closed the cover. Outside, the vicarage bell gave a single, dutiful peal. Practice, not ceremony. It sounded like a question deciding whether to be asked. Flaxborough and County Savings had adopted, as its business model, the atmosphere of a heavily supervised parlour. The vestibule smelled faintly of shined wood and determinism. A calendar near the door promised half-days on Wednesdays, as if piety still governed commerce. Behind the central desk sat Mr. Creston, manager, whose tie had the tensile properties of bridge cable and whose smile gave the agreeable impression of being ironed before use. Inspector Purbright announced himself with the modest assurance of one who intends to remove as little as possible. Mr. Creston, having confirmed that the constabulary required no overdraft, offered a chair at precisely the angle from which the public might admire the bank's probity without being tempted to share it. His office window, which overlooked the cashier's wickets, allowed him to manage simultaneously conversation, reputation, and traffic in small coins. You have made inquiries. The manager's tone placed the activity at a safe historical distance. Concerning an account belonging to, the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice. I have encountered the Friends elsewhere, said Purbright. I thought I would complete the set. Mr. Creston's smile remained trained. We maintain a sacred discretion here, Inspector. Sacred things, Purbright observed, often respond to an incantation or two. I'm content, for the moment, with liturgy rather than revelation. Quite, the manager conceded, relieved to find himself in ritual. The account existed, in a modest form. You understand that small charities run on faith and postage. We saw deposits of an unremarkable kind. A few pounds here and there, regular enough to impress a treasurer, irregular enough to disappoint a cause. Until, said Purbright pleasantly. Mr. Creston's eyes moved to the window with professional neutrality. Until a week prior to the lamented Mrs. Mowbray's death. A sum was paid in which, while not in itself spectacular, occupied that interesting zone directly beneath certain reporting thresholds. He coughed. One must not burden the central offices with every expression of confidence. Of course not, said Purbright. Confidence wilts under observation. The depositor, the manager continued, presented himself in the early evening. We keep open late on Tuesdays. The description, as recorded by the porter, is of an unexceptional gentleman. Dark coat, hat with a brim more careful than new courteous manner. He did not fuss over receipts. He did not, one might say, wish the transaction to linger. Evening, said Purbright. Tuesday. Indeed. The tie, perhaps of its own accord, tightened. And after the will was read, Mr. Creston's smile, still impeccable, rested its feet. The account was closed 2 days thereafter. The signature on the cheque, the withdrawal slip, matched the mandate lodged. The funds were paid out in cash at the customer's request, and the book was marked concluded. We make a practice of tidiness. I admire efficiency in charitable works, said Purbright. It lends such elegance to benevolence." "Elegance," the manager repeated, as if he had been complimented on the bank's cornices, "is our ambition." The friends were, I think, grateful for our promptitude. "Do you recall who presented the withdrawal?" "I prefer not to recall," said Mr. Creston, with the gallantry of a man protecting a delicate acquaintance from gossip. "If pressed, I should say the same person who had made the earlier deposit. One so rarely encounters variety among principals in small philanthropies." "And the manner in which the cash was conveyed away?" The manager allowed himself the faintest look of surprise, which on his face resembled a minute adjustment in barometric pressure. "Conveyed? In a suitable receptacle, I trust. We provide envelopes." "So I have heard," said Purbright. "Sometimes envelopes are insufficient." "Inspector," said the manager, restored to dignity, "we are not in the habit of outfitting our customers with bags." "Of course," said Purbright, rising fractionally to indicate that he had harvested what could decently be gleaned. "You have been generous." "We like to think," Mr. Creston replied, accompanying him to the door, "that our generosity takes the form of limits." In the public hall, a row of stools performed the moral function of seating without comfort. At wicket 2, Miss Vale, a cashier with the unruffled air of one who had learned accuracy before affection, counted change for a farmer who looked at money as if he were measuring hay. When he had finished not thanking her, she noticed the inspector with a small, steady glance reserved for those whose questions arrive folded. "Miss Vale," said Purbright, in the tone of a man seeking directions to a very nearby landmark, "forgive a curiosity about the Friends of St. Luke's. You have seen them at the counter?" "We see everybody," she said. "Some twice." Her hands made neat heaps of shillings that suggested moral formation. There was, I gather, a withdrawal. Considerable for a Tuesday. Miss Vale considered the regulatory advisability of memory. "The manager has spoken," she said, but the corners of her mouth acknowledged that speech has limits. She adjusted the glass tray. "Cash. Predominantly worn notes. We keep them aside for customers with the kind of conscience that prefers old faces." "Worn," repeated Purbright. "Why so thoughtful?" "New notes are proud," Miss Vale observed. "They crease loudly. Older money goes into pockets apologetically, and one can divide it without cracking." "For envelopes," said Purbright. "If one had envelopes," Miss Vale conceded. "Or compartments." "Ah," said Purbright. "Compartments." She permitted herself a glance towards the far door, where a private sign thought highly of itself. The gentleman asked for the money to be wrapped in 2 bundles, neither of them fat enough to suggest greed. He carried a long box. I asked whether he wished to leave it with the porter, as it would interfere with counting. He declined. He said it was for the flowers. "Flowers," said Purbright almost approvingly. The lid had a little green wax in the corners. Miss Vale continued in a voice designed to be understood only by those already understanding. "Some of it came away when he rested the box on the counter, just here, and it left a mark. I wiped it. The scent remained." "Carnations?" asked Purbright, because men who ask leading questions in banks must do so politely. "Possibly," she said, "or anything that disguises uncertainty." "And his manner?" "Courteous," Miss Vale said. "He apologized to the money as if it were being inconvenienced. He did not hurry me. He hurried himself." "Did he return the next day?" "It is not our policy to notice repetitions," she replied, achieving the professional paradox. "However, the porter keeps a habit of opening doors with familiarity. He opened the door for the same coat on Wednesday and did not apologize later." "Thank you," said Purbright, and meant it. He allowed the vestibule to reacquaint itself with him while he looked idly at an advertisement for saving certificates featuring a lamb of Presbyterian convictions. Outside, the high street had found the temperature agreeable for opinions. He observed, as he stepped to the pavement, a florist's boy leaning a bicycle by the chemist's window, the basket fitted with 2 narrow lids tied at the corners like tidy promises. It would have been premature to call upon Dalrymple and Son with questions that might encourage answers. Nonetheless, Purbright permitted himself to stroll that way. The shop, loyal to the principle that plants ought to look better indoors, displayed arrangements of respectable optimism. In the window, a hand-lettered card listed deliveries, Tuesday and Friday. The edges of the card bore the same dejection as committee minutes. He did not go in. The bell above the door had the expression of one that would ring confessions too loudly. On his way back to the station, he reached the Old Swan by a route which no one could have called circuitous without malice. The landlord, polishing a glass beyond all purpose, saw him through the mirror and decided to remember nothing. Purbright admired, from the corridor, a faint smudge of green wax at skirting level near the service door, which housekeeping had discouraged without quite removing. It had the shy obstinacy of certain sins. In his office, he wrote up his morning to the agreeable accompaniment of Sergeant Malley's struggle with a complaint about a cat distinguished chiefly by its sense of property rights. The notes, when finished, occupied 3 brief lines: deposit dues, under threshold, withdrawal cash, worn, 2 bundles, carrier with florist box, green wax, sent, account closed 2 days after will. He underlined worn lightly, not because it mattered, but because the kind of person who asks for worn notes often believes that new money attracts weather. He spent a temperate hour with the vicar's copies of the minute book, returned and annotated in a manner that would satisfy a curate. The marginal old account only struck him now as something more than nostalgia, a route that could be trusted not to ask impertinent questions at short notice. Tuesday, 7 to 8, room behind bar, had acquired the cheerful company of bank late-opening dues. He added, with no pleasure in tidiness, Dalrymple deliveries Tuesdays and Fridays. Old Swan custard Friday. At tea, Miss Teatime appeared, having perfected invisibility to the extent that the first evidence of her presence was a small cake taking its place on the saucer like a verdict. "I've heard," she said, "that the bank remains solvent and the town, miraculously, charitable." "Both institutions practice liquidity," said Purbright. She lowered herself into the visiting chair with the grace of a woman sitting on a decision. "And our friends? Do they continue to prefer nouns to people?" "They prefer thresholds," he said. "A threshold before death, another after a will. Between them a box of flowers." "How edifying," said Miss Teatime. "Flaxborough has always believed that money behaves better when camouflaged." "New notes," said Purbright, "are too glossy to be moral." "I have suspected as much." She inspected his face in the neutral way of a diagnostician. "And who brought the blossoms, Inspector? A gentleman with a hat morally older than his head?" "Something of the sort," he allowed. "I shall tell the Horticultural Society that carnations continue to perform a public service." She stood, leaving the cake uneaten as a theological statement. "Do try not to attend any meetings. They are fattening to the soul." When she had gone, carrying away with her the impression that nothing had been said, Purbright returned to the book of minutes. He compared the slope of the marginal J with the petitioner's initials in Mrs. Mowbray's letters. If hand alone could accuse, the case would have been considered ungentlemanly. He suspected, rather, cooperation, hands agreeing to borrow each other's habits. At dusk, with the station's clock considering whether it ought to go home early, he stepped out for air that had decided to be lawful. The bank's blinds were already drawn, as if privacy, once tasted, could not be refused. Across the street, the Regent Hotel's brochure in the travel agent's window advertised private suites for intimate dinners, in a typeface whose lowercase e leaned leftward, tired of its own respectability. The circular from the Friends had displayed the same faint limp. He stood a moment in the easy stillness that towns accept in exchange for secrecy. A man passed him carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and nothing else, the very image of business that could not bear decoration. Farther along, a bicycle bell announced that Flowers had no intention of being late. Back at his desk, Purbright wrote one last line. If money must look like flowers to move, who is meant to smell it? He closed the notebook on the question in the contented certainty that Flaxborough would not rush to answer. On the sill, the evening arranged itself, tidy and without blush. Somewhere, a clock declared it, Tuesday, miniature. The inspector, who had begun to think of days as accomplices, turned down his lamp and permitted the town to resume its usual occupation of appearing innocent. Miss Teatime announced, with the cheerfulness of a woman bringing strawberries to a meeting, that there was a most determined person spending her mornings at the municipal library's microfilm machine. She withheld the name with an artistry that made it respectable to ask. Determined? Said Inspector Purbright, doubting that Flaxborough's microfilm apparatus could sustain determination without complaint. Most, Miss Teatime replied. The machine whirs like a curate on a bicycle. She whirs it harder. The library, whose architecture had given up ambition for exactitude around 1908, smelled agreeably of cotton gloves and bookcloth. Its reading room, presided over by a great clock intent upon quarter hours, offered to the town a notion of privacy in which everyone could be politely seen. At the far wall, where the stacks of local papers lay bound like respectable memories, the microfilm reader occupied a corner as though exiled there for modernity. Mrs. Greta Pelham had chosen that corner and made of it a station. She wore the tidy tweeds recommended to women who do not wish to be surprised, and a small hat that conveyed, without insisting upon it, moral immunity. The librarian, Mrs. Bligh, had arranged a cushion for the reader's stool and a polite distance for conversation. The film, spooled in a determined loop, hummed beneath Mrs. Pelham's careful hand. Purbright, after allowing the room to notice him, drifted towards the apparatus. He admired the machine's capacity for turning time into a stream one could halt with a fingertip. Columns, headings, the inverted smugness of old advertisements slid past like a polite procession. Inspector. Mrs. Pelham spoke without entirely accepting that she had seen him. You're out early for literature. For manners, said Purbright. I'm told the microfilm appreciates callers. She permitted a small smile, the sort employed to reward pets. One must tend the town's memory. It has a way of making room for more flattering recollections by thinning out the rest. And you are engaged in rescue? In archiving, she said, and let the word rest between them like a virtue. For the good name of the departed. The good have no need of archives, Purbright observed. The departed have no need of names. Inspector, she said, glancing at the librarian as though a sermon might be overheard. We meet in a public room. Indeed. You will not then object if the public looks on while I admire your industry. He stood slightly aside. On the screen passed a succession of Flaxborough Chronicle front pages. Fete and councillors, the return of a cricket pavilion to good behaviour, appeals for blankets in winters that possessed a more honest cold. Upon each page somewhere appeared a small framed notice. Friends of St. Luke's Hospice appeal continues. Expressions of support welcomed. The wording varied less than a church notice about matrons. You have a taste for repetition, Purbright said gently. Repetition is proof of sincerity, Mrs. Pelham replied, steady on the crank. One cannot persuade the public without perseverance. The friends, he said, have persevered chiefly on paper. She let the image settle. It was a clipping from 3 years earlier, tea in aid of St. Luke's, Thursday. No address entirely committed itself. The venue had been described as by arrangement. A penciled cross, faint and apologetic, marked the item's corner. Do you mark them all? Asked Purbright. Only the relevant, she said. Relevance, said Purbright, is a comfort we grant ourselves. Across the room, Miss Bligh effected a slow motion towards the catalogue, as librarians do when they mean to be near enough to exert influence, but not so near as to endorse conversation. She addressed Purbright with the smiling severity of a schoolteacher who has watched ex-pupils become interesting. "We have become quite popular," she said, "with people who prefer yesterday. Mrs. Pelham has been invaluable in reminding the town that good works once flourished." "I am not convinced they ever stopped flourishing," said Purbright. "They may have found a less crowded garden." Mrs. Pelham, who accepted horticultural metaphors as a professional compliment, inclined her head. "It is my hope to assemble a modest record of the hospice effort. People say so much, Inspector. It is best, sometimes, to show them something without quite saying it." "Indeed," said Purbright. "There is a kind of information that becomes more powerful by being arranged." She returned to the crank. An advertisement rotated into view, notable only for the self-assurance of its type. "Regent Hotel, Barrowby. Private suites for intimate dinners." The lowercase e leaned left with that faint fatigue Purbright had noticed elsewhere. Next to it, in the personal notices, ran a small appeal. "Grateful thanks to our regular supporters. Usual channel Tuesdays." It had been placed, the Chronicle's timid code revealed, by box number 47th. Purbright did not move. He felt the small convenience of having a suspicion asked to sit down. "Useful," he said. Mrs. Pelham's hand stilled and then continued, the interval so precise that it denied itself. "One often finds," she said, "that the papers say more than they intend. It is why I am committed to archiving. Not to expose," she added, "perhaps to the room, but to prevent careless talk." "Careless talk," repeated Purbright, as if making a note of the phrase's weight. They went on together in a modest silence, while a few more months agreed to be displayed. Mrs. Bligh reshelved 3 books at a rate designed to imply that shelves must be shown who is in charge. Somewhere, discreetly muffled by the clock's authority, a child laughed once and was suppressed by a parent's glance. "I imagine," Purbright said at length, "that Mrs. Mowbray would have approved of your industry. She admired neatness." "Mrs. Mowbray," said Mrs. Pelham, and the microfilm paused obediently with the name Edith Mowbray, frozen in a list of subscribers to the parish roof fund. "Believed in the tidying power of daylight. She once told me she would, her phrase, bring everything into daylight if a certain debt were not repaid." "A debt," said Purbright. "The nature of which is, I think, entirely private," Mrs. Pelham returned. "You will permit that I say only that the matter was handled." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "Handled," he repeated, not looking at her but at the margin of the projected page, where the printing left white channels like ribs. "The verb suggests a person. Dust is swept, matters are handled." She was not a vindictive woman, Inspector. Practical, yes. She understood that sometimes a community would rather be spared a lesson than taught one. I told her as much. She said she agreed. It was before her last illness. "And afterward?" "Afterward," said Mrs. Pelham, "there were arrangements." They let this smoothness lie. Mrs. Bligh, satisfied that no misfiling had occurred, made for the loans desk with the unhurried authority of someone who can abolish noise at 30 yards by folding her arms. "Your work," said Purbright, "is voluntary." "Of course." Mrs. Pelham's smile almost touched her eyes. "The Horticultural Society keeps me idle in the mornings. I welcome a discipline. I have, if you will allow, a respect for the good name of the departed. It is not a weapon. It is a garden stake. Things lean. One props them." "Very well put," said Purbright. "May I inquire what you do with your copies?" "Copies?" She glanced down at the pad beside the machine, a small notebook stitched stoutly, its pages columned with dates and page numbers. A ruler lay across it, a pencil alongside sharpened to a theological point. "These are references." For later accuracy, I should dislike to rely upon memory. Memory, agreed Purbright, is a partisan. She turned a page of the notebook with the respect one accords to prophecies. The entries displayed a domestic orderliness. At the head of several lines he recognized in neat capitals Tuesday, as if the day itself were an item to be indexed. On the next page the word recurred with an agreeable obstinacy. Friday, when it appeared, did so more modestly. Tuesday is a good day for public life, he remarked. People are free then, she said. No one expects to be seen. And yet, said Purbright, they are. He remained standing while she made 3 quick notes that, even as they pretended to ignore him, allowed him to read them. Box, 47 appeals. Regent Hotel display. Friends' language unchanged. Her pencil made a small pause after friends, as if waiting to be told whether the word deserved capitals. You have the makings of a historian, he said. No, she replied mildly. Of a gardener, I thin. The machine hummed again, and the town's anterior life resumed. Bring and buy, grateful thanks, minor accident on Brewery Lane. He let the litany proceed, then said, as if it had just occurred to him, it must be useful, for a person who intends to ask for money, to know exactly how long the public has been in the habit of hearing the same words. It is useful, Mrs. Pelham agreed. One cannot deny that habit breeds virtue in others if one practices it oneself. She closed the file gently. I should like to think we are saving the Chronicle trouble later, when people misremember. I'm fond of our paper. It tries so hard not to say more than it means. And succeeds, said Purbright. At the loans desk, a gentleman of comforting proportions argued in whispers with his overdue slip. Mrs. Bligh, whose kindness was of the kind that keeps excellent records, quieted him with the offer of a renewal and a recommendation. She signalled, with an almost imperceptible nod, that she would be at tea in the staff room in 5 minutes, and the town would not misbehave while she was gone. Purbright returned his attention to the table. Beside the notebook, a long, narrow piece of card served as a straight edge. It had begun life as the lid of a florist's box. Dalrymple and Son, nursery men, deliveries Tuesday and Friday, ran along its edge in thin green print that thought better of itself as it dried. In one corner, a spot of wax had bled through, the colour of parish minutes. He looked at it a second too long. Waste not, said Mrs. Pelham, following his gaze with mild interest. The library supplies bookmarks, but they favour poetry. I find horticulture steadier. Poetry can disturb, he said. Flowers soothe. They do, she agreed. That is why we bring them to dinners. And to banks, said Purbright, so quietly that the remark might have been a comment on the weather. She pretended not to have heard. If you have finished admiring the Chronicle, Inspector, may I make a suggestion? Flaxborough remembers kindness the way it remembers summer, precisely whenever winter begins. If you mean to ask questions, ask them before the town decides it is time to be sentimental. A sound counsel, he said, accepting it as issued and not as counsel at all. May I trouble you for one last recollection? When Mrs. Mowbray threatened daylight, whom did the sun concern itself with? Names, said Mrs. Pelham, are overrated in libraries, Inspector. We file by subjects. She replaced the lid in its role as ruler and smoothed an already obedient page. In any case, it was handled. By whom? He asked, as if everyone might know. By those, she said, who are good with their hands. He thanked her and meant it. Mrs. Bligh, concluding that tea could now safely be taken, blessed both with a look that reminded adults to keep their voices down. Purbright allowed himself to stand a minute longer by the machine, surrendered a bow to the clock, and let the room remove him gently to the door. Outside, the day had mastered a light drizzle without passion. He walked a little way and then, out of sight of the library, took from his pocket the small notebook that contained his daily allotment of undramatic suspicions. He added, Pelham, archiving appeals, box 47. Tuesday again, Dalrymple lid used as ruler, green wax. Handled in past tense, threat of daylight. He hesitated, then wrote another line in smaller letters that asked nothing of anyone but itself. If leverage is truth saved for later, who is saving it from whom? He closed the book and put it away. From the library window, the great clock showed him his reflection in the glass, diluted and surrounded by headlines, and, inside, the microfilm machine resumed its civic hum as if the town were perfectly all right. Fenning and Kroll kept their practice on the first floor above a tobacconist, as if respecting both law and habit from a vantage that allowed neither to be troubled by weather. The stair, carpeted with something that had once aspired to burgundy, delivered Inspector Purbright into a corridor of frosted panes where the word solicitors appeared twice, in 2 different golds, as if the second had been added when optimism was cheaper. A bell chimed with the politeness reserved for clients who pay on presentation. Miss Armitage, typist and receptionist, attended from behind a Remington whose ribbon had achieved a conscientious faintness. Her hair, pinned to a standard unreachable by younger women, conveyed that the office's archives were not all on paper. She asked, with the severity to which good manners entitle one, whether the inspector required an appointment. He replied that he required Mr. Fenning only for as long as duty and a cool April would allow. Mr. Fenning is with a deed box, she said, which in law is not quite the same as being with a person, and showed him into the larger room with the air of returning books to shelves. The larger room had windows that had not forgiven last winter, and a view of the market cross which suggested that justice had always been a local product. Mr. Fenning came in, loosening a smile from its file, and installed himself behind a desk that looked as if it had signed more documents than he had. He was a careful man, the sort whose watch chain explained his waistcoat to itself. The day was not warm, yet his forehead wore a discreet glaze, as if honesty, in being exercised, had raised a temperature. Inspector, we have met, I think, in the matter of an errant conveyance. How may I be of assistance? He took a handkerchief to an unoffending spectacle lens, and restored both to their positions in the world. I had hoped, said Purbright, for the comfort only a solicitor can provide, the assurance that a will is both valid and dull. That is our specialism, Mr. Fenning said gravely. In Mrs. Mowbray's case, the testamentary dispositions are sound. She bequeathed the residue of her estate to the Friends of St. Luke's Hospice, describing them as a charitable body. We have verified the formalities. The late lady's signature is her own. The witnesses are proper. The paper, he touched a folder as if to flatter it, is the sort that persuades probate clerks to behave. Then one must congratulate the Friends, said Purbright. They have acquired responsibility without the embarrassment of premises. A point arises, Mr. Fenning conceded, selecting, as lawyers do, the most slender chair on which to place an elephant. If the named charity cannot be shown to exist in meaningful form, if, that is, it is a name without organs, then the gift, in law, is imperiled. There are principles, he indicated the ceiling where principles, in fact, are commonly stored, for applying such bounty prayers, as we say, to an object similar to the donor's intention. But to summon the charity commissioners is to invite correspondence. People, in my experience, are averse to correspondence unless they are paid to send it. And if one does not invite them, the gift, he said, reverts to the next of kin. In this instance, a niece, abroad. Gibraltar, said Purbright without insisting. Indeed. Mr. Fenning's smile arranged itself into professional sympathy. You will appreciate that foreign parts complicate virtue. The niece has been informed as a matter of duty. She has expressed no interest in challenging the will. No interest, repeated Purbright, as if tasting a carefully cooked phrase. Not even out of family affection. We cannot compel sentiment, said the solicitor, with the modest pride of a man who has learned to live without it. Her letter was civil. It assumed the bequest would be honoured. It asked only that certain papers be sent care of a hotel. An arrangement, I suppose, of convenience. "Which hotel?" asked Purbright, already visualizing a left-leaning lowercase e in a printed crest. "The Regent," said Fenning, and his forehead asked the room's air to behave. "At Barrowby." "I admire a circle," said Purbright gently, "when it remembers to keep itself closed." Mr. Fenning took refuge in doctrine. "You must see, Inspector, that my duty is to the words as written, and the estate as counted. We are not a registrar of charities. The friends appeared on paper to be capable of receiving. Being capable of disbursing is not required by the Wills Act." "Flaxborough," said Purbright, "has always held that giving is purer when nobody mentions who receives." The eyes. Solicitor adjusted a docket card with the care of a man retying a tie in a mirror. "We made our queries. We wrote to the address supplied. We received, in reply, what might be described as confidence. Mr. Hepplewhite," he added, after a pause that asked to be respected, "is attentive to correspondence." "Attentive enough," said Purbright, "to close a bank account within 48 hours of the will's reading." "Timeliness," said Fenning, "is a virtue in those who have been given authority." He provided a mandate in due form. "We understand that sums were withdrawn and certain obligations." He frowned with a fastidiousness that resisted detail. "Met." "An admirable efficiency," murmured Purbright. "Flaxborough will be proud to learn that charity, when it finally bestirs itself, moves with more decision than most ambulances." "Inspector," said the solicitor, with a dampening of a handkerchief to brow which suggested that legal ethics and room temperature had converged, "I do not wish to be unhelpful. I have neither knowledge of malfeasance nor appetite for scandal. The widow's intentions are, to the extent that law can make them so, honoured." "Law is considerate," said Purbright. "It arranges for intentions to be comfortable, even when their chairs are missing." Miss Armitage brought in a file at this point, setting it down with the same mixture of loyalty and disapproval typists bring to their employers' birthdays. The tab read Mowbray, Edith, residue in a hand that had been taught by a slate. Within, elastic bands held together a few letters, a copy of the will, and a slip of blue flimsy paper bearing a penciled notation. "Forward niece's letter, copy, care of Regent Hotel, Barrowby." The pencil had been used as if conscious of witnesses. "You see," said Mr. Fenning, tapping the slip as one taps a patient who is not expected to answer, "we do not invent our addresses." "And the niece," said Purbright, "prefers to be reliable by proxy." "People abroad," the solicitor observed, "must make arrangements." "One cannot blame them for favouring a place where letters keep their promises." "No," said Purbright, "one cannot blame them for favouring promises." He allowed the silence to do some small work. From the corridor came the quiet action of a shelf receiving more files than it had been designed to hold. Outside, in the market, a cart announced itself with iron wheels that did not object to cobbles. Mr. Fenning selected one of 2 pen holders and returned it again, having decided that this was not a writing moment. "There is one more thing," he said, adopting the tone of a man whose sense of duty insists and whose comfort declines. "It may be superfluous. The niece's letter, her last, arrived by way of the Regent, and bore, as return, the same convenience. I say this not to provoke inference. Simply to put on record, privately, that the address is much in use." "Much in use," said Purbright, "like a room hired on Tuesdays." Mr. Fenning glanced at him with the expression officials develop when the lay public threatens to understand the law. "I do not attend at hotels, Inspector," he said, recovering himself. "I have the advantage of a practice at the top of stairs." "You also have," said Purbright pleasantly, "an admirable blotter." The blotter on which Mr. Fenning rested his hands was protected by a sheet of fine tissue used in such offices to keep the day's impressions modest. The tissue had shifted. Beneath, embossed into the soft leather by a heavy nib, the ghosts of recent phrases kept house together. Purbright, whose talent for reading upside down had improved since joining the police, abstained from too much comprehension. Even so, the curved depression of Box 47 was legible, and a remnant of expressions of support welcomed, the words spaced in the assertive irregularity of a portable typewriter, stayed faintly visible where someone, copying or quoting, had leant too firmly. "A solicitor," said Purbright, "must receive many forms of literature." "More than we send," replied Mr. Fenning, unruffled, recovering the tissue as if tucking up a child. "You understand me, I'm sure. The bequest is valid. The difficulty, if difficulty there is, lies with the object, not with the disposition." "I understand," said Purbright, rising with the unhurriedness of a man not yet in a hurry. "I am grateful for your candour." "Candour," said Mr. Fenning, rising too, "is a quality best exercised before lunch." Miss Armitage, reappearing with a stamped envelope for signature, stood by while her employer wrote his name with a flourish that tidied up after itself. The envelope was addressed, in her exact hand, to Mr. J. Rook, Esquibas, at a street whose number suggested the kind of tenancy that knows when to be out. She caught the inspector's eye, with the blank courtesy of a woman whose job is to be legible, and, having achieved it, removed both envelope and pen. "Mr. Rook," said Purbright, conversationally. "A small matter," said Mr. Fenning, with the proper absence of colour. "Rates?" "Of course," said Purbright. "Rates have a way of finding one." He took his leave, the corridor's frosted glass returning him to the market's unambitious noon. The tobacconist's door opened below and released a cordial smell that explained why people persist in habits. Across the way, the travel agent's window exhibited a Regent Hotel brochure whose lowercase e leaned toward discretion. The town, moving at the tempo of errands, did not look as though it would willingly learn anything before tea. He walked without display as far as the station, counting, in the quiet arithmetic of habit, the Tuesdays that had presented themselves since Mrs. Mowbray's illness. Bank late opening, the Regent's private room, Dalrymple's deliveries, minutes in the vicar's book. The circle, obedient, drew tighter. The knot, presently, did not declare itself. At his desk he wrote, "Bequest valid unless charity not meaningful. If so, residue to niece, abroad. Niece uninterested. Letters via Regent. Hepplewhite attentive. Account closed 2 days post-probate. Obligations met. Fenning's blotter. Box 47. Expressions of support." He underlined nothing. He was, after all, only tidying. Sergeant Malley came in with the look of a man who has been defeated by a statement about a fence. "The council," he announced, "wishes it noted that piebald cattle are less visible at dusk." "Then dusk," said Purbright, "must be asked to adapt." When Malley had gone to adapt it, the inspector took from his pocket the circular for the Friends' dinner and laid it beside a trimming from the Chronicle announcing private suites for intimate dinners. The two pieces of paper, indifferent to their resemblance, lay parallel as sleepers who have quarrelled. He noticed, not for the first time, how the E in dinners sloped, and how the same slight fatigue visited the E and welcomed on the circular. Typewriters, he reflected, are loyal to their owners in ways that loyalty rarely intends. He turned the circular over. On its back, as if the paper had learned the trick from other surfaces, a faint bruise of writing had impressed itself, the shadow of a list written elsewhere and then removed. Pelham, Rook, Dalrymple. A fourth name begun and lost to the fold. He lifted the sheet to the light. The next letter, had there been one, might have been an S. He lowered the paper and allowed the discovery to diminish into the general civility of the desk. Somewhere in that civility, protected by card and custard, The truth had positioned itself politely. The town, he thought, was giving him everything except admission. He wrote one more line, smaller than the rest, as if leaving space were a courtesy. If the circle keeps closing, whose hand ties the knot? And why is it green? Then he closed the book, not to end the matter, but to keep it from catching cold. Outside, the market clock produced the hour, with a self-esteem acquired over centuries. Nobody looked up. Miss Tea-Time received Inspector Purbright as if he were both expected and late, which in Flaxborough amounts to hospitality. Her front room had perfected a formality that made conversation appear curated. The chairs stood at distances that endorsed truth while discouraging its excess. A tray waited upon a low table with cups so thin they made tea appear morally lighter. Outside, an afternoon of obedient cloud arranged the light to flatter wallpaper and avoid confidences. "You find me," Miss Tea-Time said, "between minutes and cake. I have decided the latter is likelier to advance the public good." "Minutes, in my experience," said Purbright, removing his hat to a position where it could not pretend to be furniture. "Advance nothing except themselves." She distributed Battenberg with dispassionate generosity. "The vicar's book, I suppose," she remarked, "has furnished you with reassurance that committees prefer the company of verbs that do no work." "Very much so," said Purbright. "They review, revisit, and reschedule. I have not yet seen them feed, heal, or comfort." "That is the secret of piety," Miss Tea-Time observed. "It keeps verbs tidy." He accepted the cup she offered and its aroma of domestic order. On the mantel stood a vase of an undecidable age containing 3 carnations whose whiteness had chosen to persist. In the far corner, a small clock, distrustful of second hands, undertook the quieter duty of half-minutes. "I wondered," he began, "if you would indulge me in a little speculation. Mrs. Mowbray's bequest is valid in law, but resists the habits of flesh. Friends without an address, a hospice without a ward, generosity without beneficiaries. A clever arrangement for anyone who wishes to be thought good while doing something merely efficient." Miss Tea-Time cut a second slice for him with the benevolence given to hypotheses. "You prefer people to be inefficient in public, Inspector, so that their goodness can be inspected." "I prefer," said Purbright, "that money admitted to be charitable should behave as if it had met a sick person." "An unfashionable view." She sipped. "In parish life, charity is a costume. The person inside must be guessed. We are better at guessing hats." They took their time. Miss Tea-Time seemed, as she often did, to wait for the conversation to turn up on its own rather than be fetched. When it had reached a comfortable temperature, she said, "You have been told, I imagine, that Mrs. Mowbray referred to her last charity more than once." "I have seen it implied," said Purbright. "The implication behaved well, as such things do, but I lacked the sense that anyone had looked at it by daylight." "She hinted," Miss Tea-Time replied, examining the icing's edge, "that her final generosity might not meet with universal applause. She did not say so in a tone of malice. Rather as one might observe that a sensible hat will be thought unfeminine by the sort of person who lives for feathers." "She admitted a design?" "She admitted a tidying," Miss Tea-Time corrected, with that delicacy for distinction which separates gossip from surgery. "I do not think she meant the hospice. She meant the parish. One keeps a place respectable in 2 ways, by improving it or by keeping certain improvements from view. She favoured the latter as a kindness." "And what improvement," Purbright asked, "required concealment polite enough to call itself charity?" Miss Tea-Time placed her knife exactly parallel to the plate and, having done so, allowed her eyes to wander briefly to the vase. "Years ago," she said, "and again more recently, there were debts of a sort that cannot be said aloud without giving satisfaction to people who have earned none. We possess in Flaxborough a class of indiscretion that would not convert into crime even if pressed with both hands. It converts very readily into embarrassment. That, in certain circles, is worse." Embarrassment, said Purbright, pays better because it circulates. Just so. Mrs. Mowbray told me, in those weeks when the ill prefer company that can be tidied away, that she would not allow a particular account to remain open, not money only. A promise, unpaid. There had been a threat of sorts from another. She made a counter-threat to bring daylight. Daylight is vulgar in some arrangements. She thought, with practical charity, that twilight would do. You have a gift, said Purbright, for imbuing compromise with a moral sheen. It is a village gift, she returned. Our consciences are not evangelists, they are ushers. They paused, while the clock found an agreeable number. Across the street a delivery cart expressed disappointment without shouting. Purbright let his tea cool as if he were supervising it. You think, he said, that the evening visitor to Mrs. Mowbray, who brought flowers in a box which resisted conversation, was receiving small, regular payments to retire the threat. I think, Miss Teatime replied, that his evening punctuality would credit a blood pressure tablet. He did not carry a doctor's bag, only a modest theatre. The box is an intelligent prop. It behaves like innocence, even when heavy. It obtains privacy for itself, and therefore for other objects travelling within it. Envelopes, said Purbright obligingly. Letters that cannot be posted, she agreed. The florist's wax is a better seal on the conscience than a stamp. It suggests that what is being conveyed is a message from nature. People resist undoing anything that pretends to be a flower. He considered the symmetry. A bequest to a charity that existed chiefly as a title. Donations recorded like liturgy. A bank withdrawal arranged into two smaller bundles. A lid in a corridor. Green wax making itself at home among skirting boards and trays. Typewriters too faithful to their owners' lowercase e. All this activity, it seemed, not to assist the dying, but to sustain the living in their preferred illusions. Miss Teatime, who liked matters to be phrased before they were handled, said, the Friends' dinners, if I may be allowed to call them that, served two purposes. They assured donors that their restraint would be remembered, and they exhibited, in a controlled manner, the trappings of beneficence so that the curious might take away a favourable impression rather than a fact. Controlled, said Purbright. By whom? By those who kept their names in the minute book and their hands in the margins, she said, with the serenity of someone who had once been thought too observant for matrimony, Hepplewhite for the paper, Rook for the practice, Pelham for the gardening, Miss Dalrymple for, shall we say, white. She does seem to have adopted the flower as a creed, said Purbright, and Snetterton for the errands nobody wishes to notice. Miss Teatime's eyes did not brighten. That would have been vulgar. They steadied. Basil, she said, as if counting the syllables, has made of inconsequence a talent. He is the sort of man people use when they wish their hands to remain uncommitted. He likes cash because it pays him the compliment of not getting him into print. He left the table at coffee, said Purbright, to collect what the world should not wait to see. And returned improved, Miss Teatime said, as men do when they have been approved of in a quiet passage. They gave the subject a minute's abstinence and applied themselves to cake. It was very slightly dry, an effect Miss Teatime achieved on purpose, since dryness discourages both gluttony and confession. The niece, Purbright resumed, has expressed no interest in challenging a will that would be to her advantage. Her correspondence uses a hotel committed to discretion. One can imagine a niece who prefers not to enter a quarrel conducted at the level of typewriters that lean the same way. Or, Miss Teatime suggested, one can imagine a niece grateful not to be mentioned in rooms where gratitude is not a fashion. The Regent's private suites, said Purbright, appear to be in good order. They are designed, she said, for evenings that never become stories. He reached for the sugar and did not need it. I begin to see a moral arrangement, he said. A group accustomed to rescheduling its intentions discovers that a widow intends either to expose a very small fraud or to make a very large nuisance. They offer to tidy the matter through a charity, which is a name the law finds easy to bless, if the minutes pretend to have been kept and the letters pretend to be appeals. Money moves disguised as flowers. Reputations are soothed. A bequest arrives with the admirable efficiency of tidy paper. "And what is left to vex you?" Miss Teatime asked, now that all the verbs have found their chairs. "The knot in the circle," Purbright said. "We have the rope, the intention, and the habit. I should like to touch the hand that tied it." "Then you must ask a hand," she advised, "rather than a name." They let the room become pleasant again. Even the carnations gave up pretending to be employed. Miss Teatime's spoon came to rest with its handle aligned to the clock's 6. There are towns, thought Purbright, where murder tidies this sort of business. Flaxborough is not ambitious in that way. It prefers to keep accounts by embarrassment. He felt a very slight disappointment. It was the sort of disappointment that has made many investigators retire to gardens and write letters to editors. "Mrs. Mowbray," Miss Teatime said, returning without fuss to the woman who had given the town this diverting work, "was not saintly. She was exact. She disliked loose ends, especially when tied loosely by others. I think she chose, at the end, to teach a lesson in the only language her pupils spoke: money. She arranged that her last charity would not be what the parish expected, not comfort for the dying, but chastening for the living. She would, however, have preferred the chastening to occur without anyone being able to say they had been chastened." "A difficult curriculum to mark," said Purbright. "I never said she was a good teacher," Miss Teatime returned, "only that she had a blackboard." A small pause, a drift of wagon noise. On the tray, a napkin lay folded into a conventional triangle. Miss Teatime, moving nothing else, centralized it with the accuracy of a sacristan. He watched the gesture and found himself thinking of envelopes squared inside a florist's sheath. "And the hotel letters?" he asked. "Hotels," Miss Teatime said, "are the parish halls of private life. People borrow their addresses as one borrows coat pegs. If the niece preferred the regent, it is because the regent does not mind waiting. And if a gentleman preferred the regent," he said, "it is because the regent does not ask who else uses its paper." "You grow sentimental," she admonished. "Keep to habits." They finished their tea. Miss Teatime refolded the cloth with a competence that implied she could have ordered a small regiment. "If you intend to speak informally to anyone," she said, "choose a person whose self-importance is not yet sufficient to employ counsel. Hepplewhite will be prepared. Rook will be defensive. Pelham will be horticultural. Snetterton," she added, "will be available." "People who specialize in the unimportant frequently are," said Purbright. He rose. Miss Teatime stood too, arranging her skirts with an editorial firmness. At the door, she paused and gave him, a courtesy she seldom extended, a small packet from the sideboard, tied with pale string. "A fiction," she said. "Do not open it here." He did not look at it. He put it into his pocket with the neighborly indifference appropriate to a town that distrusts flourishes. They exchanged remarks about weather, which in Flaxborough sit up straighter in drawing-rooms than they do out of doors, and he took his leave. On the pavement, he did not at once turn toward the station. He walked to the end of the street and stood by the grocer's awning, where a faint draught could pretend to be wind. Only then did he undo the string. Inside lay a piece of card, narrow and sturdy, the lid from a florist's box, cut down to a strip and used evidently as a bookmark. Its edge bore the legend, "Dalrymple and Son, deliveries Tuesday and Friday," in a green grown thin with use. Across it, in pencil, a single line in a small, neat hand: "Last charity, some quiet payment for old account. Do not quote me." The pencil, he thought, did not belong to Miss Teatime. He returned the strip to its wrapper and the wrapper to his pocket. The afternoon had not changed, but the corners had sharpened. An informal conversation seemed ready to propose itself, the sort whose minutes, if taken, should be written in a book that did not belong to anyone. He set off at a pace that would not alarm a cat. As he passed the travel agent, the Regent's brochure in the window exhibited its left leaning more frankly than usual, as though weary of maintaining posture. Purbright, without acknowledging the coincidence to his face, decided that evening would supply him with a corridor, a door that preferred not to be knocked, and a man who could not resist carrying flowers to a place where there weren't any. Inspector Purbright invited Mr. Basil Snetterton to the station by means of a note which managed to be both official and apologetic. It concerned, the note explained, a misdelivered envelope that had found its way among police papers following the dinner at the Old Swan. There was no suggestion in the wording that anyone had done anything interesting, merely that propriety, having mislaid a trifle, desired to be put right before tea. Mr. Snetterton arrived promptly, with the air of a man who has practiced arriving promptly for years without attracting attention. The porter's report later described him as pleasant, a verdict which, in Flaxborough, meant that the speaker had found nothing to report. His hat, ethically old, claimed precedence over his head. His coat, dark but not new, preferred to be buttoned. His gloves, folded in a way that denied character, remained folded even after he sat down. Purbright had arranged his office to forbid ceremony. The blinds supplied fairness, the desk offered accuracy, the chairs made companionship possible but not elastic. On the sill a geranium practiced an honesty no meeting ever achieved. The inspector placed a plain envelope on the blotter and adjusted it the way one does when hoping to be thought disinterested. "Mr. Snetterton," he said with mild solicitude, "I'm obliged to return this to you. It came to us in a manner which I cannot, even after reflection, describe in a way that would interest the Chronicle." "Most things do," said Snetterton, looking at the envelope as one glances at a clock one keeps for duty. "Find their way, I mean." He accepted it with 2 fingers, as if paper gave off heat. A faint, unhelpful fragrance rose. Something floral with an afterthought of dust. The flap bore a small bruise of green wax that housekeeping would have considered a challenge and lost. "I hope," Purbright continued, "that its contents have not suffered in transit." Snetterton gave a little laugh, designed to be grateful without owing anything. "I'm in the fortunate position, Inspector, of being content with the survival of envelopes." They exchanged an interval of courtesy, during which the envelope rested exactly where it had been placed. Purbright poured tea from a pot that did not pretend to be new, and Snetterton allowed sugar to do its work as though it had not failed him previously. "I must thank you," Snetterton said, "for your attention at the Old Swan. A great many institutions, when they announce their endings, show a surprising appetite. The Friends managed, I thought, a tidy conclusion." "Tidy," said Purbright, "is a word with more uses than one might at first suspect. It saves time, for instance, and prevents the involvement of people who would not greatly benefit from hearing their names." Snetterton shifted his gloves. "Indeed. And Mrs. Mowbray," Purbright went on in a tone that insisted upon nothing, "would have approved. She had a gift, I'm told, for reducing the untidy." "Mrs. Mowbray," Snetterton replied carefully, "had views on daylight." "Quite." Purbright allowed a small silence to assemble the furniture. "It has reached my ear that she proposed to bring a matter into daylight unless it could be—" He considered the roster of respectable verbs and selected one that improved the tone. "Accommodated." Snetterton gazed at the geranium, which had nothing to declare. "I'm unacquainted," he said, "with daylight in its accusatory sense." "Of course," said Purbright. "Few are. There is, however, a history in the parish books, dusty but not yet past use, which suggests that, some decades ago, sums intended for things of an inspiring character, bells, roofs, unglamorous pipes, were asked to linger on their way. Not stolen, that would be vulgar, only detained in order to find themselves in the company of causes with more immediate social promise." Snetterton inclined his head. as a man does when he cannot risk ignorance being taken for insolence. If such rearrangements occurred, Inspector, I was not present at the desk. I would not place you there, said Purbright. You are of the corridor. Snetterton's mouth learned briefly the shape of a smile, then regretted it. I have been accused, he admitted, of understanding corridors. They perform a civic role. They allow movement without announcement, said Purbright. When Mrs. Mowbray signaled that she possessed a map, dates, initials, maybe even amounts, she requested, in the gentle manner of someone who despises theatre, a settlement of what she termed an old account. She had a niece abroad who preferred letters to reputations. She had, furthermore, a sense of symmetry. Money detained should, at last, be escorted. Snetterton's gaze returned to the envelope, which now appeared to have grown heavier. If it comforts administration, he remarked, to think that an old account balanced itself with minimal disturbance, then administration may be comforted. Administration, said Purbright, likes to avoid sermons. They took more tea. It did not improve. On the inspector's desk lay his notebook, open at a page where nothing yet had been written, and a pencil that had acquired from long acquaintance with police fingers the habit of making only responsible marks. The weighting of these small objects had its effect. It was not, Snetterton said at last, bad money. I'm sure it's scrubbed up nicely, Purbright replied. There is, Snetterton continued, picking his words with the delicacy of someone disentangling a chain, a kind of misappropriation that is born less of greed than of an impatience with dullness. People dislike roofs because roofs are not grateful. Charity committees, some, would rather feed occasions than gutters. The sums were not heroic. They merely learned to attend different meetings. One can live a long time, he added, on the difference between what is right and what will do. And Mrs. Mowbray thought the difference had lasted long enough, said Purbright. She had accounts of her own, Snetterton allowed. She preferred them paid in an orderly way. The hospice, name only of course, was, if one may dare say it, a method. I do not hold with methods, Inspector, but I have been known to carry them. Flowers assist, said Purbright. Ah, Snetterton looked almost fond. They relieve the conscience of looking like itself. Tuesday is kind to those who decide to be unseen. And the niece? Comfortable, he said with the neutral benevolence of an unadmitted conspirator. She will not be troubled by the necessity of taking sides. We thought that humane. Mrs. Mowbray did not wish her to become a case study. Nor an heir in open court, said Purbright, a sensible woman. She was exact. Snetterton's voice carried a private respect. She asked only that the parish not be called upon to perform virtue in unrealistic quantities. The inspector turned with modest care the plain envelope so that its flap pointed toward the guest. The green wax fleck, softened and reset, showed that it had already twice imagined itself a seal. And the friends? The friends, Snetterton said, as if repeating after a teacher, concluded their affairs. There will be no more newsletters. Mr. Hepplewhite has tired of marshalling paper. Mr. Rook has tired of margins. Miss Dalrymple will continue to recommend white. Mrs. Pelham will retain, for a season, the hope that archives can prevent people from saying the wrong kind of true things. You do not include yourself, said Purbright. I am never included, Snetterton replied. It is my qualification. They sat while the clock in the outer office performed the modest ceremony of the half-hour. Somewhere in the station, a sergeant explained to a complainant that fences could not be relied upon to know which side they were, and on Mr. Snetterton put a fingertip to the envelope, and finding that it did not leap to defend itself, slid it into his inner pocket with a discretion that might have been humility. Inspector, he said, I cannot offer you a headline without altering the history. It would tidy. There were, I concede, transfers. There was, I concede, a threat of daylight. There was, finally, the good fortune of having a woman who preferred arrangements to judgments. arrangements, said Purbright, do not often aspire to heaven. They succeed in keeping the parish out of hell, Snetterton answered. It is a lesser ambition, but an honest one. He stood, not as men do when they are eager to go, but as they do when the chair has been sufficient. Purbright accompanied him to the door and returned a hat to its owner with the same correctness one uses for evidence or blessings. If you are asked, Snetterton added, already disengaging himself from the furniture, whether the friends did good, you may say, if pressed, that they did good manners. Flaxborough, said Purbright, has always recognized good manners as a sacrament. Left alone, he drew the notebook towards him and wrote a line that had waited all morning to exist. Basil Snetterton confirms. Mrs. M. threatened daylight for old parish detentions. Condition or Sartre's niece's comfort abroad. Friends a conveyor, funds in flowers, account closed thereafter. No complaint, no victim who wishes to be named. He paused, then added, less legibly, which is to say more honestly, no further action. He closed the book with the soft authority a reader gives to a volume he intends to keep, and moved it aside to let the light declare itself on the blotter. The room returned to its plainness with relief. When Sergeant Malley came in, carrying the grievance of a man whose afternoon has met a form, Purbright folded the conversation into 3 harmless phrases about weather, letters, and the unexpected economy of white carnations. By the time he walked up the high street, the town had resumed its customary employment of not noticing itself. At the travel agent, the Regent's brochure behaved. The bank's blinds were taught to modesty. Outside Dalrymple and Son, 2 narrow lids sat on a barrow like clean consciences. He did not stop. There are days when a man improves his understanding by not examining proofs. Miss Teatime stood at her gate, arranging a remark into something the neighborhood could approve. She took in the inspector's unruffled coat and the absence of paper in his hand with a hint of professional disappointment. "Well?" she said, as one might ask after a small operation performed at home. "It appears," said Purbright, "that Flaxborough has healed itself." "How unfashionable," Miss Teatime murmured. "And the charity?" "Concluded. Unpublicized." She smiled. A brief domestic crescent. "Some charities are best left unpublicized. It discourages imitators." "And fosters gratitude," he suggested. "Oh, no," she said. "It merely fosters sleep." They parted with that modest civility which, in certain parishes, passes for confession. Evening found its way between buildings without insistence. Windows warmed themselves. A cat, practicing discretion, crossed the road as if it owned a permit. Back at the station, in the unshowy light of a desk lamp, Purbright put away his notebook in a drawer that had never, in his memory, required a key. The drawer's company was instructive, cautions without prosecutions, letters that had achieved their purpose by remaining unsent, a pressed petal which might, or might not, have fallen there on its own. He shut it gently and turned the lamp so that the desk's surface surrendered its darker marks. On the blotter, faint but loyal, there lingered the wraiths of earlier phrases. Box 47, expressions of support, impressed there by papers that had made themselves useful and were now gone. He rubbed the leather with a finger and felt the words resist erasure with a courtesy they did not deserve. He thought, not unhappily, of secrets that have promised to keep each other. Then, almost as an afterthought, he straightened the stack of circulars on the corner of his desk. The topmost sheet shifted, and underneath it, a narrow strip serving as an improvised ruler presented itself, the off-cut edge of a florist's lid, its green print reduced to the remnant, "He is day and frere." The inspector examined the trimming without moving it, only long enough to see, near the wax-stained corner, the ghost of a pencil line that never quite decided to be writing. He turned the lamp a fraction, returned the circulars to their square, and allowed the strip to disappear again into its employment. The question the pencil had declined to ask stayed where such questions are kept in Flaxborough, under the crust, tidy and warm.